layman's terms with Nohra. We basically take what we think are complicated issues out there and we make them understandable for the person who is curious intellectually but doesn't have time to follow up like we do. And that's all we like to do for our audience. Our guest today is Tho Bishop. Did I say this the right way, Tho?
Yes. It's a weird name, but you got it just right.
So when a guy whose name is Guy can actually say the names right, you know they're very sensitive about these things. So I'm gonna do two things today, and for you, because I've checked your background already. I want you to tell us about yourself,
Okay.
and then I'm gonna ask you to grade the current economy. I'll be interrupting here and forth, interjecting here and forth, and then I'm gonna let you talk about your favorite subject, the Federal Reserve.
Fantastic.
Okay.
A lot to say about that topic.
And the idea is to have our audience understand. Everybody hears about it, but we'll get there. But first, let's start with you.
Yes. So as you mentioned, my name's Tho Bishop. I am outreach director for the Mises Institute. Our focus is what's called Austrian economics, which might sound confusing, right? Why would the economics of Austria have any relevance to the Federal Reserve or American policy? And realize it's just kind of a name that goes to the tradition that dates back to a guy named Carl Menger, but we're named after Ludwig von Mises, who was a great economist of the 20th century. He was someone who had to flee Austria because of the Nazis. He was both a Jewish economist and a free market economist. Hitler didn't like either of those things. He ended up in the United States in the shadow of FDR's America at the time, which made it actually very difficult for him to get a job in American economics because of just how vastly changed that intellectual environment was. And so the way to think about why this matters is that the way that we approach economics is very different than the way the quote unquote mainstream does. In some ways, it's a more of a traditional approach where our focus really comes down to understanding the consequences of trade-offs, the consequences of scarcity, understanding that there are just natural laws that exist when you're having to deal with kind of the opportunity cost, the seen and the unseen when people make transactions. And that's true at the micro level and it's true on the macro level.
Okay, so our audience, even though I use that term every day, opportunity cost, define that for our audience. So I think that's a term that would be really important for our audience to understand.
Absolutely. So that means if I have $5 and I choose to buy, apples with that, then the cost of that is not only the $5, but it's choosing the apples over bananas, over oranges, over anything else that could be spent there. It's also the cost of saving that and using it for future consumption. And so really the entire concept of civilization as we understand it comes from very core concepts like property rights, right? The ability to have ownership, savings, a sound currency that makes it easier to predict not only calculations now, but in the future. If that changes, things get things there. So these are, again, you can kind of isolate these as very, very basic concepts. But the problem is that with modern economics, things, when you start talking at the broader scale, you get a lot of math, you get a lot of modeling, you get a lot of focus on forecasting, you get a lot of assumptions, you get a lot of things. And if you look at the track record of, I would argue, modern economics, they get a lot of things wrong. They fail to see, housing bubble 2008 being a very obvious example, inflation during COVID, a very obvious example. And so that it's losing sight of this very logical approach to it. In the 20th century, there's a lot of like physics envy, a lot of desire to mathematize, to formalize. You take an economics class today, a lot of it's about like computer modeling more than it is understanding these nuts and bolts issues. And I think that really is a big problem we have today, is that people don't have that lens of economic thinking, right? Understanding that trade-off component, because we don't teach it that very well. And if you don't have that, it's a very difficult and for society to manage, to understand, how the government is doing, the consequences of this, understanding the sort of things. If we deny that very basic lens to view things, if people understood economics, they wouldn't become socialists. I think it's one of the F.A. Hayek's quotes out there, who was a student of Mises. So that's a very, very important concept.
Which unfortunately is proving true in places like New York City right now.
Very much so. Very dangerous.
I use opportunity cost a lot when I talk to people about either going to business school or some kind of master's or PhD, especially in business school, because I'm a business guy. I'm like, the opportunity cost of the 2 years, what you're going to spend versus over your life, what you're going to get back. So I try to use it with regards to people's
Mhm.
careers as well because it applies to everything. So anyway, so you were saying, keep going. I just wanted to that's a concept that I think is important for people to
Abs-
understand. So
Absolutely. And so that's the main focus of the Mises Institute does, is that we are first and foremost an educational center. We're not necessarily like a think tank in the way that we're trying to put out policy papers and things like that. We've got very strong opinions on policy, but our focus more is to improve the quality of education when it comes to economics, whether that's for students, whether that's for average people just trying to better understand things. Whether it's we've got a lot of PhDs around the world. One example, Javier Milei in Argentina is someone who is a fan of Ludwig von Mises, a fan of Austrian economics, and that's kind of one example there. Ron Paul was one of our founding members. So when you hear people really concerned about the Fed, concerned about the consequences of monetary inflation, booms and busts, bubbles, concerns about regulation and all that sort of stuff. A lot of those people are influenced by the way that we view it, by how we view that discipline. Because again, once you start recognizing these sort of things, the extent to which government can act in a way that the private sector can't, the productive sector can,
yeah,
then that goes into kind of the policy ramifications that come from that. But first and foremost, that comes from us individually understanding so that we can better understand the world around us.
good. And I know you're in charge of outreach. So how are you doing that? Because reason why I wanted you to be our guest today is actually taking your knowledge and disseminating it, in the 50 minutes that we have to our audience. So at least they start asking questions in their own minds and they try to understand the important tenets behind your economic thinking process, which by the way, I tend to agree with most of the time. So how do you guys do the outreach piece? Because I know that's what you do.
We try to do it in a variety of different ways, reaching out to student groups and getting books on campuses and things like that. Actually, coming up soon, we're doing a big celebration of F.A. Hayek's work. We're going to be giving 100,000 free copies of F.A. Hayek's work,
Ah,
available to everyone, but really focused on high school students and college students and things like that, because there's so many important lessons that Hayek
okay,
has to offer there. So we
absolutely.
have a huge student component. Actually, next week we have our Mises University program, which is a student program for advanced high schoolers, college students, even graduate students. That we kind of are trying to fill that void with a week-long program in Auburn, Alabama, where we're based. We do it through we've got popular articles, kind of normal, short sort of reads on what's going on, podcasts and things like that. Big YouTube channel, so that component to it. We also try to educate, whether it's local lawmakers, state lawmakers. There's some fans of us up in DC, even, believe it or not. And so it's that multi-pronged approach of both trying to get out in front of students and educating them, trying to get in front of professionals. There's a lot of interest, I think, right now, in particular with the medical profession, people that are interested in direct primary care and all the issues on trying to figure out all the ways that government interferes with that, very big in COVID. So professional groups in that capacity, but then also trying to educate those individuals that are in even a policy program to figure out, okay, well, given the massive wave, whether it's government debt and how it can a state protect themselves and alternatives there. But it's all education focused first and foremost, and that just kind of depending on what group of people that we're trying to reach out to in that moment.
That's crucial because and the way I see it is there's socialism well, not, communism slash socialism on one extreme and you guys on the other extreme.
Yes.
And I'd love to see you get as many victories that they do these days. You have Rand Paul and maybe Massey, arguably. They have AOC, and now who knows, maybe the guy from New York. So you've got to keep that going because I want our population to be educated on both sides. So when they hear that we're gonna have supermarkets run by the government, you can come back and say, "Let me tell you how that really works in the real world," because you need to know how. So hopefully you're gonna keep. You have to be vigilant.
Yeah. And the exciting thing too is that, like, particularly with the interest in Bitcoin, a lot of Bitcoiners or have, you consume a lot of Austrian information there. So when you see, people talking about that aspect of it, that's one way where, we have a lot more people criticizing the Fed, sometimes in ways that, we might have a little bit of disagreement there, but I think there's a lot more attention on the Federal Reserve, a lot more attention on the facade that we've been told about, so it's an independent group of very important, sober-minded experts. Like, no, it's a political institution, it's everything else. And so even though, how many orthodox, Austrian economists are there in Congress, I don't want to overstate that. But I think people are recognizing that a lot of the things that we are told on how certain systems, particularly political institutions, act are really not how they act in practice. And I think that is very helpful, and that touches on a lot of the things that we've been covering for over 40 years now.
That's an excellent point. I didn't think about that, but you're right. Bitcoin and generally crypto is very libertarian.
Yes.
And you guys, that's a great opportunity. And actually, everybody, at least until 10 years ago, everybody with crypto was under 20. So
yes.
So it's a good audience to actually have, and you can teach them through their own experiences.
Well, and to that point, the reason why, to me, that's so important is not just as a libertarian side project. I'm glad number goes up, but one of the biggest consequences, one of the things that drives me crazy when I hear economists talk about these sort of things, is that they focus on kind of the purely economic, right, prices, stocks, things. And now that's important. I'm not trying to dismiss that.
Sure.
But what I'm scared about is that the consequences of debt, the consequences of our economic policies, they're making it much, much harder for younger generations in particular to get that ladder up. We said the home affordability crisis and things like that.
Yeah.
And so the fact that there is, I'm a millennial, I'm a 35, so you're probably mid-range millennial there. But the fact that, Bitcoin was something that young people were able to kind of grasp on early and being able to see that wealth go up. I think that to me is important just generationally, because if you've got younger generations coming up that do not have opportunities or even feel like they don't have those opportunities, those goes into the deeper cultural consequences beyond just simply economics in a narrow sense. And I think that's very, very dangerous for society as well.
And that's one of my big issues, which is to educate that young group coming up that there are alternatives and there are ways to do them in ways that hopefully they will understand, which is why we call it in layman's term. So I'm gonna move on, and I'm gonna ask you to put on your economist hat for me for just a little while and grade so far the Trump administration on economics. Now, when they got in, people said, well, it's funny. They used the same playbook that we were using. Inflation is going to be bad because of tariffs, and price of eggs is going to be bad. I mean, it was like they carbon copied what we were saying 30 days before, and obviously that hasn't happened yet. So give us a honest grade on what they're doing on some of the most important issues. And I know you guys hate tariffs, but that's okay, because I spoke with your partner Connor a while back, so I tried to move him away from just the tax, the tariff tax. But anyway, so grade them, but tell us why you're grading them the way you are, so that as we're grading, we're also explaining what we're grading and why it's important.
Yeah. Well, I think that you could, if I was to give a grade right now, it'd probably be, a C plus. There's some very positive things I think that can be identified. There's some bad things that can be identified. But I think really it's an incomplete at this point, which is kind of a cop-out answer. That's why I try to start with the more concrete one. It's because, and we'll start with the tariff situation. Because to me, there is the economic argument for tariffs, right? And I've got, I think that a protectionist policy, right, is very, very damaging. There are other components that you can consider about that kind of go beyond pure sort of economic analysis. There's definitely economic costs you can acknowledge, but kind of means and ends to that. So the problem is so the tariff situation, I think, is a great example of what I think is some of the broader uncertainty that you're getting right now with, the first 7 months of the Trump administration, because it's still, I don't think, clear at this point exactly what is the aim of the trade policy. And you get different things all the time, right? Is the aim to have massive reindustrialization, massive reshoring of industries? Is it so that we're gonna make T-shirts in South Carolina rather than having them in Bangladesh? Is it because we're going to build the AI chips here rather than Taiwan? Is it going to be that we're going to increase our own domestic consumption of our own agricultural goods rather than buying them from foreign countries? I think that as a policy goal is problematic. I think global trade dynamics are there's reasons why those trade that global supply, that division of labor is important. But that's, I don't know if we're really getting that right. You see that with the way that you have different levers based on different countries, right? So I don't know if that's really the aim, but some people would say that. Is the aim revenue generation, right? When Trump was campaigning, he talked about let's replace the income tax with tariffs. That's obviously the way that America was funded throughout most of its history, right? The downside of that is that spending back when we were funding ourselves through tariff revenue was much lower, much lower, and ultimately spending itself is the other side of taxation. So if spending doesn't change, then that won't really balance itself out. But again, if the goal is revenue generation, then we're dropping it in certain areas. So that's not necessarily a concrete logic there. Is the goal to redesign our trade policy so that we are going to have reciprocal tariffs, right? If a country tariffs us at a certain amount, then we're going to tax them an equal amount, try to create the appearance of a level playing field there. I think that's some of the rhetoric that you got with like Liberation Day, the announcement there. Some of those calculations, people can point holes into, but that's one component. Or is it a geopolitical component? Is the goal to move manufacturing from China to more favorable countries? And so we've seen sort of, and that's a whole kind of different, that's a whole different dynamic there. But but right now we're kind of getting, it kind of depends on the day what sort of messaging we're kind of getting on that. I know, this past month we got the notice of the 1 monthly surplus, right? Yeah. And so people are like, like tariffs are working as a revenue generation. Well, will that continue over time? Or was that, because of this uncertainty where people kind of eating it now, they're hoping that you're going to have these trade deals, right? Is the goal more trade deals? And it's that case that's going to cut down that revenue component to it. Because we can think about tariffs, as really kind of a consumption tax, right? Yeah. So it's just a different type of taxation there. Not all of it's going to be passed on to consumers. Some of it's going to be eaten up by sellers, but that's neither here nor there. But that's just kind of it's a consumption tax. Is that going to be the continued path there? We'll see. Are we still not seeing the full ramifications of the broad tariffs? Right? Are people going to start buying less? Are people going to start importing less to sell? Those supply chains can be very long. We saw that with COVID, where some supply shocks early on the supply shocks we saw did not really manifest themselves until later on in the process there. So again, there's just, I think, a whole lot of uncertainty that goes into that. So if the goal is to get better trade deals, right? If the goal is to actually increase trade, perhaps modifying who we are doing trading with, then that's actually a pro-trade argument in some ways. Kind of the see what the details work out. And so that's not an anti-trade component. So that's going to factor in on the real impact that we're going to be feeling 2 years from now. Then if the goal is to reduce trade, right? So again, I can't tell you with any certainty, and I think any economist would be mistaken to have any sort of certainty on how things are going right now, because we've gotten a lot of different signals. So that's kind of the trade component to it.
Okay. Inflation.
And inflation, well, we had a little bit of uptick in some of the measures that we saw this past month. Overall, it's been lower than it was before. Part of that is because but that itself is kind of interesting, because really the source of inflation is not tariffs. The source of inflation is increase in the money supply, increase on that aspect of it. Milton Friedman, even, who is not an Austrian, said inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. And so we have not seen, but see the other side of it is Trump is wanting the Fed to do more. And
on that subject, so I went to Chicago, so I'm for business school, so I'm pretty familiar with a lot of the economics concepts. I was surprised at how fast inflation came down, because usually it lags and it's policy driven. What do you attribute the fact that it came down so quickly under President Trump, almost to a halt? And price of eggs is the people's favorite example, but other things. So what do you attribute that to?
I think there's probably a few different components to it. One is that I think there's probably a lag effect where the Fed, again, go back to complaining about the Fed.
We're going to get there.
Yeah, I know, but this is an element of it. So the Fed allowed rates to be way too low for way too long, and additional elements with all the Biden level spending and things like that, right? There's multiple reasons on why inflation was so high during the Biden years. But the Fed started pivoting back. You started seeing some money, the real money supply start dropping, and so that played a role. That was kind of a lagging effect. There's definitely supply side aspects of it that Trump administration did do. There was a lot of action on the eggs issue in particular. We started seeing falling energy prices. Energy prices are going to be factored into a variety of things. And so there's definitely aspects of it, whether it is the deregulation regime, some of the executive orders and things like that. So I think there's a variety of aspects that played into it. But ultimately, again, one of the drivers of the money supply is going to be the spending side of it. And that's kind of the real issue that we have right now, is that this isn't a Trump issue. This isn't necessarily a Biden issue. This is a government issue where we are addicted to government spending. And you saw this in full display during the Big Beautiful Bill debate, where you had people like Elon Musk and Thomas Massie warning about the long-term consequence of adding more debt. Now, I think that conversation is even more complicated. It has its own nuances there. How much of that additional debt is coming from tax cuts? Is tax cuts being I would argue that I'd rather have the debt rather than the tax increases that would have if you did not have that bill. Some of those are going to be more targeted. I think aspects of it with the service industry, the no tax on tips. I like that as someone that, again, very concerned about that, people overrepresented in that industry. But the problem is that beyond just the negotiation, there's some, I think, good things done in terms of Medicaid and some of our entitlements, which are a massive reason for our fiscal situation. The problem is, though, it goes back to it's not the Big Beautiful Bill spending aspect of it. It is what it signals about our unwillingness to deal with other forms of spending. Right? They had that budget bill, that budget battle back in December, right, where Trump, even though he wasn't in office, was, let's get a deal, right? We're going to be relitigating the discretionary components of the bill in the future. And I think what people are recognizing, both with the Doge not being as successful as some people hoped, both seeing the gamesmanship from Republicans wanting their own sort of gimmies, the SALT deductions and things like that. I think there's a general willingness, a general observation that even with a Republican-controlled Congress, a Republican-controlled Senate, a Trump in the White House, that there is no real appetite to really curb the spending side of that equation, not just now, but in future budget bills that are inevitably gonna come across. There's no return to the standard process, right? We haven't actually done the budget process since the 1990s, which is kind of crazy. And so I think that is what's driving a lot of the uncertainty in bond markets and things like that, is just the recognition that DC is too addicted to the spending part of it. And again, if you have the spending part that is still running out of control, then you can cut taxes, but you're still going to be paying for it elsewhere. You might be paying for inflation. You might be paying it in other ways. If you don't get the spending side of it under control, then there's all sorts of consequences that go on in the economy. And so until we get that aspect of it, it's going to be very difficult to really get our house in order, even if we have improvements relative to other policies when it comes to regulation, when it comes to this sort of stuff. And I think all the eggs, I think, in the administration's basket, right? When you hear Scott Bessent, they're projecting, okay, well, if we do the regulatory side, if we do the trade side, if we do this other stuff, they're saying growth is going to solve all of this. And I hope they're correct, right? I would love to see nothing more than a growth bomb, and the way that can help change a variety of aspects in the future. But we've heard that a lot. That's the question.
So that's really important for our audience to understand, because you articulated it so well, which is that there are too many factors that are happening, which tell us that we're not really addressing the issue. And at some point there will be a price to pay. During Biden, it was inflation. But the big hope that when people ask me, what are you guys doing? Because I ran for governor as a Republican, and I'm a conservative and so on. So I tend to be put in that basket. I say, I'm not in there with everybody else, and I don't know what's going on, but you might be able to outgrow a lot of the deficit, et cetera, et cetera. You can outgrow it. And I think, the Treasury Secretary has spoken about 333, and I try to make it simple, but basically I say we're going to outgrow it. So if there's a great economy, we're going to be able to kind of dance around. So you touched on that. That's really, really important. So anything else on the economy that you would want to talk about as far as how things are? One aspect, and I don't know how Austrian School of Economics thinks about it, is I I've spent a lot of time the last 10, 15 years. I'm a venture capitalist, so everything I do is about looking at people and how they, trying to predict what they're going to do and how they're going to do it, and learning about
Mhm.
people. And I have a feeling expectations. So my explanation for the way things are going, and they're going as well as they are so soon, because usually these things lag, right? They lag
Mhm.
policy. Inflation lags policy, and all these things lag policy. Is just the people's frame of mind.
Mhm.
Psychologically, somehow, despite the threat of tariffs, people are just in a frame of mind, especially small business,
Mhm.
of this is it. We're just going to do our thing, and then that psychology becomes self-fulfilling,
Mhm.
and the price of eggs goes down. It's just anyway. So, anything else that you wanted to add as far as the economy?
Well, and I definitely think that sort of psychological boost is itself a reaction to just how bad things were during the Biden administration,
Yeah,
where you get a number of horrible policies,
awful.
just the insanity there. I think that kind of, I think that's why you kind of saw that Trump 2024 coalition, where you had, obviously not only Trump supporters, but you had libertarians, you had tech bros, you had all sorts of, a lot of Bitcoin support, things like that. Is that you had a very diverse coalition thinking, okay, Biden was so bad that they created all these common enemies, and they all work together. And it's like, okay, well, we're going to find a way of each of us kind of getting something that's going to, I think, motivating to try to make a real difference going forward. And so I think that it definitely improved, I think, consumer sentiment in that regard. It's like, okay, this is a massive burden of the previous administration off our shoulders, and we'll see what comes
Okay.
next.
Yeah.
Now, again, how much will policy reflect that going forward? Again, I'm open to upside and downside situations. I don't think that we are
Sure.
on a straight road that is guaranteeing us to this, that, and the other. But I do think that the economy that Trump inherited, and this is important, was much worse than the economy that he inherited in 2016.
Hmm.
We were on the road, and we might still be. I mean, again, it's a possibility that we were on the road to recession. Right, the
Hmm.
Fed's a half point interest cut, again going back to the Fed, but this is just more of a signal than a critique. But doing that in the months before the election, that is usually one of the best indicators of a recession coming a year or so later. Um, the labor market right now seems very, very tight. Very, there's a lot of not great signs there. A lot of the jobs in the Biden administration were government jobs. So does that ease up? We're still dealing with the consequences of the housing market. We have high mortgage rates, we have high housing prices because we reinflated that bubble. What does that mean in terms of the construction industry? What does that mean in terms of say young people being able to buy so there are signs here that show very bad signs. Again, a lot of them inherited. And so, what will the full impact of this mix of policies interacting going forward? Does this produce the growth that the Trump administration is projecting? Again, I'm not going to say here and say
Yeah.
confidently one way or another. We'll see how
Yeah.
this all goes. But there are some real warning signs that need to be recognized. And there's aspects of what the Trump administration is doing that I think are going to help that, and there's aspects of it that are red flags. So we'll
Yeah.
see how things progress from there.
Okay, so that's a great explanation of the two subjects I wanted to discuss initially, and hopefully, if I summarize them, you're cautiously optimistic, but the grade is probably an incomplete
Yeah,
because we need to see how things play out. But they were dealt a pretty tough hand.
yeah.
People shouldn't forget that's Inflation Reduction Act was probably one of the worst things that's ever
Mhm.
happened to this country, I believe, economically. And they were dealt a tough hand, and they've got to go ahead and change course. So, your favorite subject. So,
Yes.
I'll tell you what I learned when I was in college and business school. There's this thing called the Federal Reserve, and they're in charge of interest rates. And they were created after the Great Recession. After the Depression, because I don't know why, because people felt that having a central bank was a good thing. Really, I mean, even in school, like you don't know why they were. They tell you it's because
Yeah.
there's going to be somebody who is going to not let the system explode the way it did during the Great Recession and the 30s. I still remember one of my professors at Stanford saying the head of the head of the Fed is the most powerful person in the world. That was just a comment from one professor. So if you may, and I read your paper, but of course I'm a wonk, so it's different. We're talking to people that every once in a while wake up and see that Trump's fighting with Powell because he's not decreasing interest rates, or they wake up and they see that the Fed is going to increase interest rates and the stock market, went up or down. Just totally irrational stuff going on in the world based on the Fed's action. And of course, quantitative easing, people heard about that, on and on and on. So if you were doing a Fed 101 lesson to fifth graders, go ahead and go for it. And I'll allow you your biases.
Excellent. Well, I'll try my best. So the Fed was actually created after the panic of 1907. J.P. Morgan kind of got tired of being the lender of last resort there. So you got that in 1913, part of the Progressive Revolution with all sorts of things that happened that year, not many of which I'm a fan of. And so the goal of the Fed is, so there's a few different things that they would say is their purpose, right? That they are to be the lender of last resort, that if everything is crashing down, that they are the backstop to make sure that major banks don't fall down, because if major banks fall down, then that can kick something up. Like that's something they would claim. That their goal is to set monetary policy to balance inflation and unemployment, and that if inflation runs, inflation can run really high, and that would lead to, but the trade-off of that would be high unemployment, because the idea if inflation goes too low, then you'd have so you have high unemployment. If you have low inflation, you can have a high employment and high employment rates and high inflation. And so their idea is, okay, we're going to be kind of the thermostat, and we're just going to kind of control. We're going to make sure the speed of a car, right? They're going to make sure it doesn't go too hot, doesn't go too slow. The problem is,
they pick what I think is an arbitrary number of whatever.
Yeah, 2%.
2%, right? It's just, we don't know why, but that's the number they managed for.
And it's important to make, he's like, this is all very new, like in the grand scheme of things. Like there was no 2% inflation prior to the Fed, right? Really prior to World War II, like that really kind of normalized that sort of stuff. But like it's a purely arbitrary number. That means you're losing 2% of your money every year. If they hit their target, obviously they ran much higher than that during certain years. It all kind of fell apart in the 70s because you had both high inflation and high unemployment. You had what's called stagnation. And so the problem is it's the entire belief that the economy can be tuned like an engine or a thermostat. Like it's this entire kind of mechanistic idea on what the economy is supposed to look like. Whereas like the Austrian viewpoint, we don't view the interest rate as a policy tool. We view the interest rate as a market price like anything else. Interest rates go up when people aren't saving, right? So interest rates, and because the price of saving, the price of money. And so if people aren't saving, then you increase the price to encourage them to save. And that's what balancing things out. If interest rates are low, it means people are saving a lot. That makes it easier to go on and do longer run, right? You think about, you're going to build something big, you want a low interest rate there. So that encourages long-term capital investment and things like that. And so using interest rates as a policy tool from our view, manipulates what this market signal is supposed to be. And so so when you go too hot, you get a bubble and they pull it back and you get a bust. And the problem is when you start getting that bust, they go back hard. It's like they don't want to, you might hear a lot about business cycles, right? Recessions, bubbles, things like that. And kind of the mainstream view of it is a recession is a problem that needs to be solved by policy. Our view is that the bubble is the problem, that the recession is the return to prices. Prices fall to reflect that. There's been investment in different fields that were not backed up by demand. The housing bubble, too much investment in housing. We were giving loans to people that didn't need it, right? That built that up to be too hot. Prices should have been allowed to go back down. But instead, they try to reinflate the bubble. And so this has been basically the way that modern public policy is operated, is trying to solve the recession rather than stopping future bubbles.
So if we use your thermostat analogy, they're trying to keep the temperature at 68% at all times, when in fact, recession is telling you that something's broken in the house and you need to go fix the heater or the air conditioning, rather than worry about the thermostat.
Right.
Is that okay?
Yes. It's kind of the Goldie Bears example. Yeah. One's too hard, one's too soft. Mama Bear is just right. Right. And the goal, every Fed chair wants to imagine himself to be Mama Bear. And so what we've seen is that as time has gone on, like Fed chairs have gotten a lot more, a lot more ego. Like people used to worship the altar of Alan Greenspan in the right. But he became but that tends to evolve around a lot more activist Feds. Like the Greenspan was very active, and it's also kind of fun. Like you'll see kind of the way they play this game. They'll go in front of Congress and they'll say things that are like impossible for anyone to understand. And then if you actually read like their internal emails, like they're very plain spoken, and so they kind of create this mystique, right? That's the Wizard of Oz sort of component to it. And so that's a whole can of worms in its own right. But I think what's important to understand is that the Federal Reserve that you learned about at the University of Chicago is not the Federal Reserve we have today. So regardless of all the critiques that we might have had back in the day, 2008 changed everything. 2008, the Fed has operated in ways that have never been seen throughout history in terms of how money is conducted. That's where you got the zero rate, basically near zero interest rates, right? We're giving away free money. Some European countries were giving had negative interest rates, which means that that's even crazier, right? The Fed's balance sheet, so like the assets the Fed holds, has massively skyrocketed. And it's not just treasuries. I mean, they started throwing real estate on there during COVID. They were buying everything, right? So we go away from this idea, like there's an old maxim in central banking, is that the way to address a crisis is for the central bank to be the lender of last resort, to be free flowing with cap, to buy what it can, but at good collateral and at a high price. That yes, we'll backstop, but we're going to pay it. But you're going to pay a premium for us to backstop. But there's that's the romantic idea. Instead, we were buying bad assets, and we were charging very little for it. And so what that does is it shifts the risk to the taxpayer. I mean, right now, if you were to put to market the assets the Fed has, the Fed is massively in the red right now, which is that's a whole nother can of worms. But the way the Fed has operated since 2008 is the way that central banks have never operated. Now, because we're the Fed, every other central bank has operated the same way. And so some of your listeners, right, they might be familiar with people that have been telling them to buy gold for 40, 50 years. Right, we're always on the verge of a dollar collapse, right? We've been hearing this from people I know Ron Paul was warning about it, and so the question is why hasn't that happened? Why hasn't the dollar collapsed like we told it was when we were going off the dollar or off the gold standard in 1970s? The reason why is because it's not just America doing this; the rest of the world has done this. One of America's most important exports has been what I would call bad economic ideas. Right? So every other central bank acts the way the Fed does. Some act even more extreme. Yeah. Some act even more extreme than the Fed. Like there are crazy cousins. Some might be a little bit more moderate, but they're much smaller. So we are the biggest. We're the biggest pool. We're the biggest fish in the pond. We are the global reserve currency. And so if everyone else is more or less doing what we're doing, then the consequence of that policy is not going to hurt the dollar relative to other currencies, right? And so what we're seeing right now, though, is that if you ignore our comparison to other currencies, we're seeing gold start going off, right? People are now looking for the longest time that U.S. Treasury was considered the safest asset in the world. Well, now people are a little concerned about that. So they're buying gold, they're buying Bitcoin, they're buying assets that are not other fiat currencies, they're not other government currencies, they're not buying other government debt. They're looking for alternatives to government inflatable assets. And so we're seeing that market behavior right now, which to me is a big, big red flag for where this global monetary system is going. Again, I'm not predicting the fall of the dollar tomorrow, anything like that, right? We are, for all of our problems, we're still a lot better than the euro. We're still a lot better than the Chinese state bank, right? We're still a lot better. Yeah, any big player out there are, for all of our problems, and we've got many of them, our central bank is not much worse than anyone else. In some cases, actually marginally better. China has the same bigger debt problems and all that sort of stuff.
Sure.
So I'm not worried about China taking us over anytime soon, right? Economically. So that is, but again, 2008 has changed everything because the Fed is operating now in the way that never has before. Even like the interest rate, the the Federal Reserve rate, which is kind of the measure when Trump talks about lower interest rates, that really is a lot less important today for the Fed than it is the money that they pay banks. And so during 2008, they started paying money on excess reserves. So they're paying banks not to lend out money. And so that's the way they kind of control, that's their main policy tool to control how money is going into the real economy. So if they want to roll that back, then they're going to pay more for banks. Banks get free money, right? So they don't have to put any sort of risk at all. So that's going to pull it back. If they want banks to lend out more money, they're going to lower that. So you've seen some senators have talked about the fact that, it's kind of weird that we're paying banks not to lend right now to American businesses. We can go a whole nother category about how banking regulations vastly consolidated the banking industry too. That has bad ramifications. And there's the intermixing of banking and money. But that's a whole nother rant. So this is the way that things have changed dramatically. And I don't know if a fifth grader could understand that. But hopefully your audience can understand that, again, this environment we're in is very unique. It's very novel. Anyone who says that they know, like, that they have a firm grasp on it, things have changed so radically that it doesn't matter how many PhDs you have. It doesn't matter how intelligent your brain trust is. We are dealing with things that there is no history of dealing with right now. And that gives me a little bit of concern. And that's why people, again, by their own decisions, are seeking safe haven in things like gold, Bitcoin, and other assets.
Okay, so to summarize, up until 2008, they had a pretty basic role of keeping the thermostat at a certain temperature. And they did that either through increasing or decreasing interest rates and whether buying or selling bonds, treasury bonds.
Yes.
That's all they did. In 2008 comes along, big crisis. Usually many things change during a big crisis like this. And in that case, they became much more active, maybe too active in way too many things. And so it was 12 people in a room kind of deciding that's how we're going to save the financial system. Is that how they work?
Pretty much. And it's funny, actually. I think it was actually 11 because one, you had a consistent dissenter at the time. This kind of inside baseball, but Thomas Honig was kind of warning about Bernanke's policies, who was the Federal Reserve chairman during the 2008 crisis. Like you did have a little bit of dissent within the Fed ranks saying this is bad. But yeah, and the thing is, like, so, and the goal again, right? Low interest rates going to boost growth. Well, again, the economic recovery in the Obama years was very, very low. Why? Because like the more that growth is kind of being driven by public policy, and Austrian economics will recognize something called Cantillon effects. One of the great things out there, if you Google the Wall Street Journal for Cantillon effects, it never comes up. But what Cantillon effects is that it's the first receiver of new money, first receiver of new credit, benefits the most, and it's those that are the furthest away from that benefit the least, right? If like by the time that they get that dollar, everything's inflated, right? Prices have gone up. And so what we saw is that real estate in DC was doing great during the Obama years. Elsewhere it was down, right? Certain pet industries were doing great. The financial industry was doing great because they're the ones managing everything. And again, what we have right now is we don't have a system of capitalism. We have a system of financialization, where the financing side of the economy, look at car manufacturers. Our biggest car manufacturers, their biggest business is financing the cars more than the cars themselves, right? And so we've had this entire driven dynamic based off of these more radical approaches to monetary policy. You get greater consolidation, right? The way that Facebook was able to become the giant in social media is because we had very cheap interest rates. Their debt. So that created greater demand for their debt. They could use their debt to buy smaller companies. So you get corporate consolidation, right, as a byproduct of this. There are all sorts of additional factors that pervert the real economy that go beyond simply inflation. in these sort of dynamics. And one of the biggest things is that if you look at wages, people, you'll hear from the left all the time about income inequality, and Thomas Piketty wrote a book about poverty, about all this sort of stuff, right? Well, he fails to ignore that wage growth was keeping at par with the rest. That this massive divide between wage growth and everything else came about during the 1970s, where we went off the gold standard. We had this growing financialization, and so during the Obama years, if you were invested in financial assets, your wealth went up. If you were working paycheck to paycheck and couldn't invest, you did not see that same growth. And so this is where you get this very, this very regressive component of the Fed's monetary policy, where you even have certain left-wing, what we would consider left-wing economists, identify these additional consequences of the Fed's aggressive monetary policy. A lot of progressive economists, like the MMT, the modern monetary theorists, and the AOCs in the crowd, they love the Fed because they can, they can justify spending more money and that sort of stuff. But you have some that actually care about that wealth gap, recognize that the Fed itself is an engine of inequality. And so this is an issue that should motivate you, whether, regardless of your viewpoint on the political scale, there's something to be seen as something problematic with the way that we are conducting monetary policy in the 21st century.
And I think that's something that's very, very important to explain to people. And I don't think we the public hear enough of that. Ironically, it's usually President Trump who's saying this, because his populist instincts understand that. But we don't hear that. If I just went out and interviewed 10 people who even knew what the Fed is, they would say, "Oh yeah, they're the lender of last resort. Yeah. They kind of keep things under control. They, they're the protection at the end of the day when my bank fails."
Right.
But in fact, your argument, which I think definitely should be out there, is that they are one of the tools of this growing wealth gap, which is why socialists got elected in New York.
Right. Right. What's funny, and Trump's when Trump was running in 2016, he actually kind of made this point. He said, "Look, I'm a real estate guy. Low interest rates are great for me, but if you're out there and you're saving and you're doing it the right way, then you're getting screwed." And then he won. And the thing is, nobody wants to be the president when the bubble bursts, right? And so, I get it, right? Like, I get it from that dynamic. That doesn't change the economic consequences, but I get it. But he even articulated this component to it, and so again, he gets that dynamic a little bit. But again, it's no one wants to be the president when the Fed ranks up rates. When you get your Volcker moment back in the Jimmy Carter days, right? He massively increased interest rates that broke the stagflation environment, but nobody wants to be holding the bag when the bubble bursts.
And again, so we're going to touch probably to the little more sophisticated parts of the people that will listen to this, because hopefully also some people will be listening to it that are sophisticated. The Fed, they as a decision-making group, they do have a lot of control over so many parts of our economy. And a lot of people now that I talk to, there's a conspiracy theory around, the Fed and what they do and how they do it. How do we explain that in a way that we all don't want to be, tinfoil hats, but something is going on here, and it's probably not for the best of the average people, which is really who I care about as a politician when I was involved. So what? How should people be looking at the Fed now? This very overly active.
Yes, they should see our current monetary system as something that is not benefiting average workers, average Americans. Now, touching on again, I think there's a very simple explanation on why. You have this continuation of it, where it doesn't really matter who the Fed chair is. You kind of get a similar sort of view of the economy, and it's not really a conspiracy. It goes into some of the other aspects that I think are broadly being recognized now, which is the consequences of higher education developing groupthink and not a sincere pursuit of knowledge, right? So if every major expert economist learns a similar form of economics. If they have the same methodology, if they understand how it operates, there might be disagreements here and there on the margins, right? Okay, we should be doing policy X rather than policy Y. We should be our rate should be at this percent rather than that percent. But they're all working off the same general intellectual framework. The same way that so many history programs in the country, it doesn't matter if you're in a red state or a blue state, you're gonna get some form of like watered down Marxist theory because most historians are consuming some form of Marxist history, right? And internationally, right? A lot of central bankers, you look at where they got their degree, they got it here in the United States, and so they're thinking similarly, right? And so the problem is that we have a much larger intellectual problem. And the intellectual problem is that our institutions that in theory should be providing the social service of seeking intellectual diversity and pursuing truth and challenging each other, right, are instead creating more echo chambers. They're consolidating what is acceptable to think. This is true in climate science. It's true in medical care. It's true. So we see all these areas where we have a massive cluster of bad judgments coming from the expert class. And it's not that they're dumb people. It's not even that they're sinister people. Some of them might be, but I don't think that's ultimately the real issue here. The issue is that they're all thinking the same way. And so that's again goes back where the Mises Institute steps in, is that so we have tried to keep alive this tradition that's very well outside the mainstream, but try to help not only educate normal people, but develop PhD students and people that can engage with seriously the sort of intellectual debates that hopefully still matter when it comes to shaping which way society can go.
Okay, and given the fact that they're here to stay, how do we clip the wings so that yeah, maybe a different way to ask the question. You're king for the day, and I tell you we can't disband them because that will create huge problems all over the world, the
Sure.
world and the economic system. How would you bring them back to whatever spirit they were created to help the economy?
Yeah. Well, so there's a few things that I think would be fairly modest steps in that direction. One would be to remove the balance sheet component to what the Fed does right now, like to remove that control, because again, it is again, you look throughout history, they had very little on their balance sheet. Now they do, and that is a massive tool that they use.
So they don't buy assets, they don't sell assets. They're
Right.
out of the financial asset buying and selling business.
Right.
They leave that to the private market.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and the second thing would, and again, this is where political influence and political pressure comes in, right? But it is being a lot more cognizant in terms of recognizing the importance of recessions when it comes to navigating certain economic crises. So so going back to central banking principles, that would be closer to that traditional viewpoint, that when you have a massive issue where we're only going to be buying good collateral at a high price, right, restraining it back, and then that's require a concerted intellectual effort to do that. The other side of it, though, which I think is the most important aspect of it, which wouldn't even require the Fed, is to make it easier for individuals to protect themselves from the consequences of the Fed. And you can do this very simply. I was trying to get some traction on this with the Big Beautiful Bill, didn't get some success, but maybe in the future it will be an idea where time has come. Eliminate the capital gains tax on gold, silver, and Bitcoin. And what that would do is that would make it easier to avoid the tax ramifications of saving in outside the dollar system. We're already seeing a lot of states embrace different sort of things to remove their own taxes, right? This gold is a constitutional money, so you could, that's why you have like a Texas gold bank and things like that.
Yeah, Texas, yeah.
And so even if, given that I don't expect any sort of massive reforms, even the very modest ones that I suggested happening at the Federal Reserve at any time, to me, what I'm most interested in as a policy tool, which does not require reforming the institution, is allowing that component where citizens can effectively decide and protect themselves in the long run. Because I think if you had enough of that behavior, you're either going to have two responses. One is that you're going to have a crackdown, right, which is FDR confiscating gold during the that's one dangerous way it could go, right? But that would require the government to take an action there, or that itself would create the feedback loop that is necessary to change and perhaps help push the Fed to reforming the way it does things. So if you have an exit, if citizens have the ability to exit, I think that itself could create a very important pressure that could perhaps achieve some of the larger structural reforms that are necessary.
So an exit from
being overly reliant upon saving, in particular, on dollars, treasuries, things like that. You can treat a bank account with dollars the same way that you would treat a vault with gold or your crypto wallet. And that itself, again, particularly looking long-term saving, I think that would create a very important tool there. We're already seeing our play out in the market right now, but that would help. And actually, we had a little bit of change recently where banks can now price gold holdings on their balance sheet, I think, on par, where usually there was a discount that they had to do with their accounting. So we're actually kind of seeing that a little bit here and there. But that to me would be something. But that's for banks. Applying that to the citizen level, I think, would be good too.
Okay. So the way to I guess explain it is that it's a system that is really helping the few, mostly financial institutions and people that kind of rely on them and work with them, and it's not doing much for the average person.
Correct.
The way it's set up now.
Yeah, to me, like, this is the ultimate populist cause, because if you don't like big, the Fed creates big. So if it's big banks, big business, big tech, big whatever, right? And that's why, like, you look back in American history, who was our first populist president? It was Andrew Jackson. What was Andrew Jackson's signature move? It was going against the central bank.
And he shut it down?
Yes.
Yeah.
And at the time, they were making the same exact arguments I was making now, that workers are getting hurt, the speculators are benefiting. And so this is something that is American as apple pie. And so, but this was the original populist issue. And I think it's just as important as a populist issue in the 21st century as it was in the 1800s.
Very interesting. I think that's fascinating. It's interesting. This will be one of the more specific discussions I've had on this issue. But I really, really hope that the people that are listening are going to take a closer look at what the Fed does, their role, good, bad, and different, and really to understand, because I think you touched upon it. If they're part of the problem of wealth discrepancy, which you're saying they are, my biggest concern in general about the United States is a civil war. I know I'm going on a tangent here, but one of the biggest factors in civil war is wealth discrepancy.
Yeah,
it's just that simple.
Yeah, you go back to says it. Yeah, I mean, you go back to Rome. It was land reform that create a whole lot of problems back there.
Exactly, and I think if they're contributing to this, that's not good. And I think there's something that needs to be done. So anyway, so I gave you a chance to talk about your favorite subject. Anything else you'd want to tell us about in general? So we have an interesting next 9 months. Then you get into election season and the world changes and everything. We have an interesting nine months coming up. What should we be looking for as far as economic indicators that are going to tell us how the following 2 years go, regardless of what happens politically?
Hopefully we'll start seeing, and I think we've seen a slight increase already. We saw this during the Trump first administration. I care a lot more about salary increases, adjusted for inflation, than I do about stocks. Again, nothing against anyone that owns stocks, but I think that's that is one of the most important measures. So hopefully we'll see that go up. Hopefully we'll see certainty come in with the trade system, whatever that might look like afterwards. We need certainty there. Hopefully that will lead to, my hope is that leads to better trade deals rather than less trade. I know the FHFA has made some decisions to try to help on the financing side on the housing situation, which hopefully that will help a little bit. But to me, the biggest measure is going to be, what do Treasury bonds look like? I mean, obviously that's an easy measure for everything, right? And so, because I think the reason why Treasury yields are high now, which if Treasury yields are high, it's going to increase the financing of everything else. I think a lot of this is concerned about our spending situation. I think I think that reflects a lot of the gradual uncertainty. And so until there's, if we have a serious discussion about the budget coming up, I think that would go very well. I know we're already working on some rescission packages. Again, I don't think there's the political will to start really changing that curve when it comes to spending. But any slight movement there, again, given the way the rest of the world is, just a slight move there would have a massive impact, I think, because it would show that America's a lot more serious than a lot of our fellow countries out there. Again, I'm not expecting that, but that would be the biggest thing to help, I think, move treasuries down. Because again, ultimately, if Trump changes the treasury, the Fed chairman, again, I've got plenty of critiques about Powell, but the idea that you can simply replace Powell, lower interest rates, and boom, we're back off to the races. I don't think treasury yields are going to follow that. And so that's, to me, the biggest issue. And that's why, again, there's a lot less flexibility I think Trump has this time around than the first time around because of so much extra baggage in the system from then. So that's the one thing I'm most worried about.
Yeah, and then you have, it's not just one person, right? It's several. So you'd have to change all of them, if not most of them.
Yeah.
Well, that was incredibly helpful. I really, really appreciate your time. I think that one of the reasons I come back to you guys all the time is because the world sees what Keynesian public policy is, economics are. They see every once in a while they hear about supply demands, but no one gets to hear about your school as much as I think they should actually. And it's something that I want people to be exposed, because our audience is they're people who care, but they're too busy living their lives. They're too busy raising their families. They're too busy paying taxes.
Absolutely.
But they do vote, and they do go out, and they actually do get involved. So hearing your opinion is crucial as they make up their minds.
And I think that's why we have, I think the biggest problem we have right now is that people view economics not as a discipline, but as essentially a form of propaganda, right? On the left, it's propaganda for big business. You see it a lot on the right to now, where why would we care what economists say? They're always wrong, et cetera. And they're right. The biggest tragedy we have is that the profession that is supposed to be making this case, the economics profession, and this includes a lot of groups out there that are pro-capitalism and pro-free markets, they have ignored the Fed as a problem. And if you ignore that, then you can be defending deregulation, you can be defending all this sort of other things. And I'd agree with all those policies. And it's good to have low taxes. But if you're ignoring the Fed, then you're going to, because that engine of inequality aspect, I'm not going to be surprised when people just stop listening to you. And when people stop listening and stop recognizing that free markets and capitalism is a key component to a civilized society, then we're we're in a very bad situation there. And we've already, I don't think there's much hope for the left, but we can't lose the right on that issue either. And so if any of your listeners are interested in learning more about the Federal Reserve as a topic, we've got a great documentary that we came out with last year called Playing with Fire. And that's at Mises.org. That's MISES.org/fire. It's also on YouTube. But it's a great documentary, a lot of good production value. So that'd be another, if anyone's interested in learning more, that'd be where I'd point them.
We'll make sure we'll hashtag that, and I think people could kind of get deeper on this. So thank you so much. I really, really appreciated your time.
Thank you, Gabe.
I'd love to talk to you some more. I think we're going to, because yours is a school of thought that I want to make sure gets much more prevalent out there, much more exposed to the world. So again, thank you for your time. We'll talk to you hopefully in the next year or so. We're going to check in, see how things are looking.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Thanks so much.